Hey, it's Kley. Welcome to another video. This is going to be the next step in me building a guitar effects pedal. I'm going to try to show as much of the build as possible on camera. In this video, I want to walk through and try to provide some explanation of what I am doing in these video clips. Hopefully you'll find this helpful and maybe pick something up, whether you built a pedal or not before. Hopefully some of this is helpful. So in the last video, we went through a lot of how you gather your materials. You picked your project, you've ordered all your stuff, it's come in, so now it's time to build. So, as I'm starting in this video, I'm populating my PCB. Now I have a computer open next to me where I've got a list of the bill of materials, and I'm just referencing that. And now I like to start with the resistors. So I've got my packs of resistors here. Now I did not buy a set of resistors specifically for this build, I'm just pulling from my parts stock. So I've got a little bit of mismatching. You can see I've got a large brown resistor there, but everything else is fine. And all I'm really trying to do is just go through and get all the resistors in place. I like to start with the resistors because they're probably the easiest and simplest of the components to put in. And when you get them all soldered in, they don't really get in the way of anything. One thing I do try to do as well is kind of do them in batches. So like this build had a bunch of 10Ks and a bunch of 100Ks. And so I was trying to go through those first so I've got my pack of 10Ks out. I kind of go through all those one at a time. So I'm skipping around a little bit. But you basically just go through your bill of materials, grab the resistor, you bend the leads with your hand, and you put it in place. Now I think best practices as far as making the very best build would probably call for putting a component in place, flipping the board over, bending the leads, soldering it in, well, probably clipping the leads, soldering it in place, and then moving on to the next one at a time, placing it and soldering it. But I'm employing a technique where I put all the resistors in place, and now I'm transitioning to snipping some leads and then starting to get ready to solder. My soldering iron is warming up right now. Got my solder. You can see here I've got rosin core 6040, and I find that solder works really, really well for my purposes. Get my iron heated up. Now with these first couple, I'm experimenting with trying to clip the leads first and then soldering. And what I found is when you solder first and then clip the leads second, the act of actually clipping the lead can sometimes cause some distress to that joint. But I do find it a little bit more annoying to clip it first, just because it doesn't always work perfectly. It doesn't always sit in place real nicely. So I do kind of prefer to go about it that way. So I kind of am using a bit of a mix. I'm just kind of experimenting. I did a couple where I clipped the leads first and then solder, and now I've soldered the leads and I'm clipping the leads second. I don't know if it makes a tremendous difference, and both ways are probably fine. Like I said, I think maybe best practice would be to cause the least amount of stress to the joint, which would mean you clip it first, but I find it a little more practical to do it this way. So yeah, kind of experiment it with as you wish. Want to comment a little bit, you can see I'm using it's called a third hand. It's that metal clippers thing that's holding the PCB in the air. This one that I've got is kind of a cheap one, and I honestly don't love it and maybe would not recommend it. I think I got it on Amazon for like $10. But the problem is it's not extremely rigid, meaning it doesn't hold the PCB in place perfectly. You can see it kind of move and shift a little bit as I'm soldering. I would maybe prefer one that's as capable of being slightly more rigid. And then also the teeth in the pincers are actually pretty tight and sharp, and they actually will dig into the PCB, and depending on where you locate it, you might actually dig into your traces, which I don't like. So I'm using these little cardboard kind of buffers. I mean, I think I could fabricate something, like maybe using like some kind of plastic material or maybe like a rubber material to give it a little bit extra, but I don't know. It's not such a big deal, though. I've done a ton of pedal builds without the third hand. I will say they're really convenient, but yeah. So then at the end of the resistors, I did go do a once-over, and I just do a visual inspection, and I just kind of reflow a couple joints that maybe don't look perfect. and I just want to make sure I'm getting it quite right. So now you can see I moved on to the capacitors section here. And with the capacitors, I tend to be a little more cautious. I've got them all placed into boxes by their markings, and I also have my capacitor code guide. I'll leave a link in the description, the one that I use, but it basically just helps you cross-reference. So like if you're looking for a 102, is that a 0.01 UF, or just to make sure you got it right. I do have this little handy tool here which lets me confirm the value of the capacitor really easily. Again, I got it on Amazon for maybe $15, and I really would like that, and I would recommend it. And with capacitors, again, because I'm pulling from my stock, I also want to make sure that they are like close and in spec, because some of the parts I've got in my stock are pretty old. So just I find cross-referencing them with that checker to see how close they are to the stated value is really nice. I have done some builds before where I like, so if it's a 102 is the capacitor code, I've gotten that off in my mind. So every time if it called for 10 nanofarad, I put like a 103, and I had that wrong. I had it off by one. It should have been 102. I don't have complete command and mastery over these anyways, and so I found for my purposes that it is just helpful to try to fix both the human error and the error with the parts, if there ever would be. It's just a little bit better way for me to do it for my purposes. All right, so just continuing on with my capacitors here, I want to comment a little bit on soldering technique. I'm not going to go into tremendous detail. There are some nice tutorial videos on the internet that you can check out, but one of the things that I try to do with soldering, so first, I find it really nice if you have a soldering iron that has the ability to have variable heat. So this cheap iron that I've got does actually have variable heat, and so it actually works quite well for that purpose. And the ability to dial in your heat is really nice, because if you're struggling to get good soldering joints, a lot of it is related to heat management, I think, in my opinion. So getting your heat just at the right spot, if your heat is not hot enough, the solder is not going to wet very quickly, and you're going to end up with dull joints, where the solder is maybe just sticking to the component leg, but it's not really flowing through the entire joint into every little crack and crevice. But, on the other hand, if it's too hot, you run the risk of burning and harming your components and frying them. So you kind of need to find a happy medium. I think I put my iron to maybe I think it's 300 Celsius is the marking I've got there, which I think is maybe around 700 degrees, but some of that is dependent on how clean your tip is, how frequently are you wiping it off on a wet sponge. That'll drop the temperature, some of those kinds of things. If you use a tip that's really dirty, you can have spots that are hotter on the tip than others. So you want to really try to keep that sucker clean, which I'm kind of guilty of not doing enough. But then, when you're actually trying to solder, and you can see here I'm just trying to touch up some of these. But when you're actually trying to solder, what I try to do is place my iron so it is contacting both the pad, the via, the actual spot on the PCB with the hole, that it's touching that, and it's also touching the component at the same time. You really want to be contacting both, so you're getting heat transfer onto both of those things. And I know when I was first beginning, sometimes I would rely more on having a hotter iron and then contacting the part, and then relying on that to transfer the energy through the leg of the part onto the trace, or onto the via, the hole. And that's really not a great technique. You really want to be making sure that you are contacting both and heating up both with the appropriate amount of heat. And then what I like to do is, so if I'm holding my soldering iron in my right hand and my solder in my left, I will contact both the component leg and the via on the right side, and then I will actually apply solder to the left side of that leg or that via. And then you can actually see when the solder wets, it will actually suck towards the iron. And I find that that's a really good way to make sure that your technique is good and you're getting good contact there. So you can see with these pots here, if you kind of watch that real closely, you can see I've got my soldering iron in my right hand and the solder in my left hand. I'm not applying the solder directly onto the iron. I'm applying it to the lead just slightly, a slight bit of distance away, so that it really sucks and flows in towards the iron and is making everything nice and wet. So now we're moving on to filling, or I guess mounting my parts to my enclosure. This enclosure I did hand drill, and unfortunately I did not get that footage, but with the hand drilling, I use, a lot of the times these builds will have a template that you can print off onto a piece of paper, and then you tape that paper to your enclosure and use that. And then I basically use start off with very small drill bits to make sure it's accurate, and then I slowly step my way up to bigger and bigger drill bits till I get the correct size holes that I want. And then I always try to have the parts on hand so that when I actually get to the right spot, you can actually see if the part fits or not just by physically putting it in, and then you just kind of get it sized that way. So I got my DC power jack installed. I got my LED, so my other parts are ready to go. And then, so now you can see I've populated the rest of the components on the board. It's just a matter of continuing through the bill of materials. And now I'm going to get all this applied. Now, one thing that I also do at this point that I did not show is I like to test the circuit board. So you can see I've got those 4 leads, and I'll bring that and I'll use alligator clips and a spare set of input and output jacks, and I'll hook it up to an amplifier and just test the effect and see if it actually works at this stage of the ball game. And I find that's a really good check just to make sure that my PCB is functioning correctly, so then I can kind of, if I'm having problems, I can eliminate at least that as a variable. So now I'm applying some leads from the switch to the 1/4-inch jack, and I kind of like to use, I've started to use color schemes a little bit because I've got some different colored wire, which I would recommend. I got a spool, like a 6-spool thing from Amazon, and it's got a bunch of different colors. So yellow is input, blue is output. And it just kind of helps me stay organized. That's actually something I got from amp building. I know some amp guys will use colored wire to help identify the signal flow. So for me, yellow is input, blue is output, red is power, and black is ground. So got my PCB to fit in nicely. Had to kind of massage it a little bit, and I used top-mounted jacks, so I actually mounted my PCB a little lower than I maybe would have been ideal. The knobs are looking a little low, but I'll probably use the top for some graphic. And just want to get them tightened in. And we're getting near the end here. You know, another thought that I have at this point too is you want to be a little cautious about over-tightening these washers and these nuts, just because the components are, these pots are soldered onto the PCB, and so really cranking on them, you're going to be cranking on that connection in the PCB, and you don't want to mess that up. So now I'm just trying to get these leads kind of as neat and as close as possible to where they need to be, and again using my snippers and my pliers here to kind of shape and form them. This is the part where I do try to be as detailed as possible just to eliminate any problems. And you know, some of these connections on these switches can be a little close to one another, so you do want to be making sure you're getting things that aren't touching wrong. You can see I twist the wire in my hand so it conforms a little better and tighter into the shape, and then I use my tweezers to form the wire accurately. Now I'm doing my 9-volt. I don't have a battery. I cannot remember the last time I plugged a battery into one of my pedals. I always use a power supply on a pedal board. So for me, that's how I choose to wire it up, just because that's how I would use it. And it gets a little cramped down in here, but for my ground, I'm actually going to be, I've got a ground on the DC jack. I've got a ground on my PCB, and then I've got 2 grounds on my pot, or on my 1/4-inch jacks, and I'm just going to be soldering leads, kind of using the one of the 1/4-inch jacks as a star point, so to speak, that everything kind of comes in and out to. So all those grounds are going, like, I think it's the input jack. You can see I'm feeding them all into the input jack ground point. There's probably 3 or 4 wires going in there, using that, like I said, like a star ground. Just to, star grounding is a concept I picked up again with amp building that I really like. Now with these ground connections, one thing I will comment on is you do need to increase the heat on your iron a little bit, because they're contacting with the chassis. So you need a little more heat to bump those guys up. Now I've got my 9-volt, so I need to run, and all of this is kind of dangling. I've got a lead coming off the 9-volt in, into a resistor, and then that's just flying to the positive leg, and then the negative leg goes to the switch, and the other side of that switch contact point goes to ground. You can see I'm doing a ground here. That's going to run to the switch. So yeah, this will be the end of the build, and let me know if you guys enjoyed this kind of video, and we'll have a tone demo coming here soon. Thanks for watching. Bye.